Futurist is all about thinking hard about the changes that might happen in the next few years, in the next 5 to 10 years. London Futurists is concerned that the next 10 years might see some more fundamental and profound changes in human experience and in human society than in any preceding 10-year period in history. Because technology is being worked on by so many people, technology is building on top of previous technology's insights. Isaac Newton said way back 300 years ago that he could see far because he was standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, today the world is full up already of giants, and there are so many people in every corner of the world who are able to take advantage of all the insights of all these other technological giants because of the internet, because of open source software, because of wikis, because of free online educational courses. And so we are constantly being surprised and impressed by what people are doing. And as a result, technology is going ahead in leaps and bounds. And one area where it's going ahead in leaps and bounds is in our understanding of possibly the most complex organ in the universe, which is the human brain. Not my human brain, but the human brain. And
yours is pretty complex too.
Mine's pretty complex, but so is everybody else's. And the goal is, can we actually make that very complex organ more effective? Can we make it more productive? Can we get rid of some of the biases and mistakes in reasoning that we've all inherited from our biology? Some of the instincts which we acquired in our prehistoric past when we were roaming in the African savannas and in many other things. These were instincts that served us well in these days, but when people are trying to take complicated decisions about the future of humanity, when people are discussing complex negotiations about new technologies, when people are taking decisions that have long-term impacts, some of these biases are not very much in our favor. So can we enhance the brains? And even more than can we enhance it, how should we allocate the resources fairly across all people in society? And to talk us through these issues, we are very lucky indeed to have somebody who has been thinking about the brain for 20 years and more, and has done a lot of work on neuroscience. He describes himself sometimes as a lapsed computational neuroscientist, but don't let that word lapsed put you off. He is very active in reading the latest papers about the deepest understanding of how the brain works and how the brain might work if we apply some of our technological insights. Whether it's insights to do with chemicals that might change how the brain works, whether it's insights to do with taking parts of our processing out of the brain and into IT systems, into a distributed intelligence. That may help us to take our decisions as well. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Anders Sandberg, the James Research Fellow, James Martin, a Research Fellow from the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, who's going to talk us through the question of brains, brain enhancements, and the distribution of brain enhancements. I've been lucky to see a shorter version of this talk already in Paris at the Transvision Conference a couple of months ago. It is absolutely full of insight. And rather than Anders trying to squash it all into 40 minutes, which he did in that stage, we've said take up to 2 hours, but Anders will stop at various times and allow people in the audience a chance to share their brain insights as well. So, Anders Sandberg.
Thank you very much for having me here. And well, as David said, this is in a sense a recap of a talk I did earlier. And you might notice sometimes that the rhythm of the talk might be slightly odd, because I had some extra ideas since I did it in Paris. I got some good input from the audience and so on. So maybe if the rhythm seems a bit off at some time, just think of it as being translated from the French. And when I started the French talk, of course, I had a picture of the statue of equality, égalité, sitting there pondering a brain. So this is the only slide I really changed, and now it's, of course, Lady Justice, who's not exactly the same thing. And when we talk about a just distribution of something, we mean something slightly different from a legal concept of justice, of course. We're interested in an ethical question. So I'm going to look here at the social and ethics of modifying brains. And we can, of course, start thinking about how do we distribute brains. Maybe not in this way. In general, the problem with brains is that they tend to come as wholes. there is a part of a brain is rarely interesting, except if you're a neuroscientist. It's not like we could distribute them. There was, at a brief period in time, actually an idea that you could do it. The concept was due to experiments on flatworms. A guy was running a flatworm through a very simple T-shaped maze, and the food was to the left. And the flatworms learned, of course, to go to the left, and then after they learned that, the experiment, they chopped them up and fed them to other flatworms, and lo and behold, the other flatworms now turn to the left without any training. Obviously, the memory that you need to go to the left in the maze, well, that was somehow chemically encoded somewhere, and you could learn. And people started joking that maybe this is a solution to what to do with old professors, just put them up and feed them to the students. Unfortunately, it turned out that the experiment was rather flawed. It didn't wash the labyrinth very well, and they left slime trails. That was the actual reason. But for a while, since people didn't know what memory was, having it as some form of chemical in the brain didn't sound totally crazy. Later people moved on, maybe it's some kind of DNA or RNA, and eventually we realized that no, it doesn't work that much on the molecular level, it's much more in the connectivity of the brain, which is why we need entire brain, entire neural networks to do useful things. Now this is of course slightly problematic because it is very much effort to make a good network. On the other hand, the rewards of having a good neural network in your head are pretty enormous. I doubt you can read anything on the slide. I'm just showing it that there is a lot of data here. Kind of hand waving towards, yeah, there is data. And of course, if you have a lot of human capital, that is the skills and knowledge you get, typically from education, some people acquire it quite well on their own, generally your country will tend to do well. Societies that have a lot of human capital tend to be able to use that to make a lot of money, produce a lot of goods, make nice institutions. Of course, having money and a lot of healthy goods and nice institutions are also really good for developing human capital. It's very much a virtuous cycle going on here. And it's not just that GDP increases if you have human capital. Those red dots floating above are kind of cheating by having a lot of oil. And Luxembourg is kind of cheating by having a lot of money lying around. But most of the bulk of that diagram to the left is because of a big society full of people who are smart and coming up with new solutions gets richer. This is also true in terms of innovation. If people have a lot of skills, they're of course good at coming up with new ways of applying those skills, which tend to make things better. So this is quite a nice reason to want to have better brains. And of course, in a post-industrial society, this is really important because you don't really become rich by having a lot of resources unless they're really expensive things like oil. You will become rich by having these skills and capital. And these individual abilities, they're of course quite tricky to acquire in interesting ways. It turns out that the correlation between GDP and human capital is about 43%, which is pretty good. The problem is, of course, it's really expensive to get a good education. Let's just continue briefly on this. The problem is also that a good education, it doesn't necessarily last. I remember when I learned programming, object-oriented programming was the new hot thing. These days, of course, this is the old-fashioned. Of course, everything is object-oriented. I don't know what an IDE is, but apparently that's what the young people today use to make their software. And so on and so on. I'm several generations behind when it comes to programming. I think I should be using a text editor like Emacs, which is about as old as I am.
Yeah.
No. Meta X control is much better. And of course, we have this ancient fight going on between the editors, which has also been going on for as long as I have. Meanwhile, the youngsters are just wondering, what? Why? There is Ruby. And I have no clue what Ruby is. And the problem is, of course, 20 years down the line, people are going to go, what? Ruby? What's that? In a rapidly changing world, of course, skills get obsolete at a fairly rapid rate, so you need to relearn them. And this requires mental flexibility. And here we have a really interesting problem, because as our lives get longer, we are actually going to have more obsolete information. Also, aging introduces other problems. We might lose a bit of our capacity to learn quickly. It turns out that it's not that old people have bad memories. It's generally that we learn more slowly and retrieve information more slowly, which means that most tests are pretty unfair. If you just give everybody 10 minutes for each question, the old people will seem like you're doing worse, but it's actually like you have shortened the test time for them. Now that lack of speed might be problematic, but you also of course got various diseases of aging that also impair your ability to remember. So a lot of the human capital can be lost over a lifetime. It's not just that it goes obsolete, it's actually that a lot of it is hurt by our brains getting older. And one way of fixing that would be, of course, better life extension. But we still need to learn and relearn and modify how we function over our life. And that is quite tricky. Now, it turns out that having a good neural network is not good for a lot of different things. I'm not going to be focusing that much on IQ. I think IQ is a crude measure, and I'm not really interested in intelligence per se. I'm going to be generally talking more about cognitive ability, which is a large bundle of things which are more or less strongly correlated to each other. But obviously, what we measure with IQ is the ability to solve certain kinds of questions, and they correlate very well with the academic achievement, mostly because they have been imitating each other for a long while. It also turns out that, job performance in many jobs correlate rather well with your IQ score, especially for more complex jobs. This is sometimes more a matter of meeting a threshold. You need to be sufficiently smart to get in, but then other factors might actually matter. It's well worth recognizing that pure intelligence is not always what you want on a job. Debt collectors, for example, need to have high emotional intelligence. It might be hard to imagine because it sounds like a rather antagonistic situation, but of course, that's where you really need your emotional intelligence. Managers need to have a social abilities that are good and not just be good problem solvers. And of course, as anybody being in a university knows, making a really smart professor a manager is not always a good idea. Now, given that if you have a high intelligence score, you generally tend to do well in school, you tend to get a lot of education, and that tends to affect your occupational level and income. It also has more interesting effects on health. It turns out that if you measure cognitive ability in childhood, you can use that to predict fairly well health later in life. Not just health status, but also longevity. And very interesting studies demonstrated that it lowers accident risk. If you're smarter, you're going to generally take risks in a more careful manner. There are some really interesting and slightly creepy studies from my native Sweden, where we have used the fact that all Swedish men who did the draft, they went through a standardized intelligence test. It got put in a giant database, and since we never throw away a giant database in Sweden, but instead put it together later on with some surveys on who ended up in jail and so on, we know that, it has a very strong link to delinquency rate, but also intelligence protects you against being murdered. Being smart is a good way of getting a safer life. Actually, I need to amend that sentence a little bit. It's not that very smart people are very safe. It's rather that if you're dumb, you're much more at risk. In many cases, it's actually the worst off that are getting into trouble because they don't get the good health habits. They don't plan ahead well enough, and they probably get the wrong kind of friends and end up being murdered. There are various interesting experiments on economic games where you can see that smarter people are better able at handling prisoner's dilemma type of situations where you get cooperation, which might be rather hard to maintain in a group where you have unknown other players and they might betray you. If you're smart, you can reason through many of these loops of thinking about what the other person thinks about you and actually reach cooperative outcomes better. So that seems to lead to that smarter people actually do better economically and might actually be planning more later into life. It even has some effect in preventing unhappiness. I have some little calculation for that. And again, being smart doesn't make you happy, but being dumb tends to make you unhappy. And of course, these poor people standing there on the sunken tank right now really wish they didn't do mistakes like they have done. And they really need intelligence now, of course, to come up with a good explanation to their officer what they did. It turns out that in the UK, apparently lost keys cost about £250 million per year in terms of changed locks, lost work income and so on. And of course, standing payment orders cost about 400 million per. There's a lot of little losses in society because of stupid mistakes, forgetfulness and so on. It turns out that sleepiness causes 15 to 20% of road accidents. And heaven knows how many other accidents, including accidents in hospitals, that are because of people being sleepy and not really paying attention. Now, you might argue that intelligence sounds like it's a really great deal. This is what we really need to focus on. But one should recognize that this is one part of the big equation. I already mentioned, of course, these feedback loops. Having a good environment around you might help your brain develop so you can make better use of the environment. It turns out that you can improve the IQ of children in sub-Saharan Africa by giving them a treatment against the parasites. Because the parasites are, of course, stealing nutrients from their brains and impairing their growth. So their school results improve when we get rid of the parasites. Which means that now we're going to make better money in the future, and hopefully that means a society that is better able to resist parasites by having better sanitation, and so on in a virtuous cycle. There are other effects, of course, like in a society where some group is not getting education because of racism or economic disadvantages. Again, a lot of brains are not being used. So there are other factors, and they can be as large as the intelligence effect or even larger. But I'm going to focus on what we can do with brains, because like zombies, we neuroscientists are proper obsessed with them. Okay, in general, there are network effects also. Being slightly smart is good for you, but it seems to be even better for society, because being surrounded by smart people that are doing long-term planning and so on seems to add quite a lot to the economy. So this can be estimated sometimes by looking at environmental toxin models, where people are trying to reduce the amount of mercury or lead in drinking water, which are of course removing IQ from society. And it seems like a small change in IQ in the whole population has a fairly nice effect on total GDP. There are a lot of debates on how to measure this properly, and it's especially fraught when dealing with national IQs. There are differences when you run the test, but of course at this point people will immediately start accusing of racism and other things. So there is quite a lot of heat and not that much light in this debate. But even when you go through the data very carefully, it seems like, yeah, there is a fairly strong link here. Another interesting thing here is to look at the really smart people. What use of it? I mentioned that it's bad for you to be on the lowest end of the IQ curve, because a lot of bad things tend to happen to you. What use of the geniuses at the other end? And it turns out that if you look at the top percent of people at the American SAT score and follow them through life, rather unsurprisingly, they tend to do rather well. But if you compare the top 1/4 of this percentile and the lower 1/4, you find that the top 1/4 actually have twice as many patents. Of course, a lot of these people go on to become professors and doctors and do rather well in life. But you still see that the super smart people actually do produce surprisingly much extra. And patents, in a sense, is a crystallized piece of your contribution, of your creativity to society. You have taken some of your ideas and turned them into something society needs. It's a very imperfect measure, as any critic of intellectual property knows, but it actually gives us some evidence that if we had a world with a bit more smarter brains, things might actually get much better. So that's about it. Yeah, this is about different jobs and their average IQ and so on. I think the main point here is if you have an IQ that is about 120, you can take practically all jobs in society. Not necessarily the high status cool jobs. Sometimes you actually want something simple. My first philosophy PhD I met, he was working in the post office. Well, I was working in the post office too, just to get money. But he had gotten a PhD in philosophy and decided he liked being a postman. the interesting thing is he had a choice. Because he was smart enough, he could probably take on most jobs. So you get a lot of opportunity by having a neural network that works well. That's kind of nice. Okay, and as I mentioned, there is some evidence that being stupid makes you unhappy. That's the red line to the right. Okay, so that was the first part. I mean, now we're making a spiel that it would be a good thing for us individually and a society to having a lot more brains. Before I get in on the enhancement part, I wonder, are there any questions about this? Yeah?
On that distribution of occupations, social scientists were quite high up. And that surprised me because I thought, well, with social science, you can just make anything up, can't you?
I think if you compete by making stuff up, you need to make stuff up in a more compelling way than your competitors. So,
bullshit.
Actually, making compelling bullshit is a surprisingly hard skill.
The causality is reversed. You have to be that to become a social scientist.
We have a question over here.
Sorry, a few things. First off, you mentioned the correlation between cognitive ability and economic well-being. Is that something that behavioural economists like Stephen Levitt would agree with?
I think so. The thing is, being smart doesn't guarantee that you're happy. It just gives you a lot more opportunities to find something that makes you happy, and you avoid stuff that makes you unhappy. So this produces a correlation. Smart people can become happy and unhappy about very strange things. I see that a lot in Oxford. I find people who are deeply unhappy about questions about the multiverse or the mathematical theorems, or extremely happy about some property of a gene. Meanwhile, my slightly dim uncle, he's mainly concerned about how his one sports team is doing.
The quality of data regarding correlations to cognitive ability, is the data good?
Depends on what data you look at. There are some natural experiments which are awesome. Like one study, this was the US military. They have been kind of gathering a lot of data because they want to not admit people who are too stupid. And the reason for that is not any discrimination against them. They don't really care, except that people on the wrong side of the curve are very expensive to educate and they don't make good soldiers. So they actually have instituted the cutoff point, and occasionally, because of bureaucratic errors, failed at that. So they got a group of people who should have been admitted, so we can actually compare them. And there was a very interesting study where we looked at pension and retirement options, where we could compare the options chosen by people, whether they're getting a lump sum or an investment later, as a function of how the smart, in this case it was officers, how they were. And you could see that the smarter people were much more long-term oriented. So the bulk data, a lot of the big surveys, one should take them with a great pinch of salt. But there are particular experiments which I think tell us a fair bit that it's useful.
I mean, have anyone compared correlations here with you mentioned with regard to the quality of the neural network? How about compared with the quality of the social network?
Here is an interesting problem, because if you grow up surrounded by a lot of people and you're a friendly, outgoing person, you're going to get a lot of stimulating discussions. Your teachers are going to like you and going to tell you a bit more, and you're going to get rewarded in many ways when you excel at things. So you're actually going to be in a more stimulating environment. Meanwhile, somebody who's not outgoing is actually going to have a less stimulating environment. Now, the problem here is that part of your intelligence will be used to, of course, to be social. But your social abilities, some of them are just personality and mood, are also going to affect how you develop. Separating these ones, it's possible to use very statistical method, but of course, it's slightly tricky because a lot of this is correlated with each other. You have a question?
I wonder whether your proposition is a bit too unnuanced, can't think of the right word. Wouldn't it be better to think of the different kinds of intelligences that other people have identified, such as Martin Gardner, your mathematical ability, your emotional ability, your map finding, and then to make some judgments about that? Because I think just lumping it together as intelligence is perhaps obscuring a more complex picture.
I agree that the real picture is more complex. However, one should recognize that Gardner's different intelligences actually tend to correlate rather strongly with each other. They're actually, you can argue how strongly, so some of these intelligences I'm not even certain you can count as an intelligence, there might be more personality factors. Spiritual intelligence, for example, I'm not certain what that refers to solving problems of. But mathematical and musical intelligence, for example, yeah, some people have one, some people have both. Generally, you tend to see them score together. In my presentation, I'm going to be unnuanced, and I'll make no real apologies for that. I'm going to be mainly interested in lumping it together in a crude way, because I'm kind of more curious about the ethics of manipulating these things. In reality, of course, in the future...
I'll just come back on that. So you correlate mathematical and music, but do you correlate them significantly with emotional intelligence?
Actually, there is a fair bit of correlation there too. Not quite as strong as between mathematics and music, but there is a fair bit of that. Now, the problem here is, of course, when we talk about emotional intelligence, quite often we conflate some nice personality factors like conscientiousness and agreeableness with the ability to actually solve emotional problems or control your own emotions. Some of which I think properly could be regarded as kind of intelligence in the sense of solving problems in order to achieve your goals, while others are, what are your general goals in life? So this is an area where there are a lot of nuances, and one should be aware that, yeah, I have a section at the end where I'm discussing this kind of non-cognitive aspects, like motivation. Obviously, if you have endless intelligence but no motivation to do anything, you're not going to succeed very much in life. Well, if you have loads of motivation but still are fairly dim, yeah, we know many examples of people being very successful with that strategy. So I'm hopefully going to be able to show where it matters that it's kind of intelligence is a more pure cognitive problem-solving aspect versus the much more loose ability to achieve ends that you're setting up for yourself. Let's take one question and then continue.
The effects, are you saying that they are due to the absolute level? Because to me, it's more the relative level, in the sense that somebody who is less intelligent will always be, given the structure of the society, will be less unhappy. So if you move the bell curve, but without changing the structure of the bell curve to one side, you're not increasing happiness.
That is a very good question, and it probably depends on what you use intelligence for. So if we think about competition for getting into these jobs here, if everybody got smarter, the curve would probably look roughly the same. It would just have moved. So so far your happiness is dependent on what job you can actually get. You don't get any change. However, think about accidents. It seems likely that people will not have, everybody will have much lower accidents if they get smarter. So you might still be part of the dumb group in society, but you're smart enough now to avoid accidents that would have hit you.
There are no accidents. There's always somebody causes an accident. So there's always
it depends on the setup, but yes, the context of a society is an interesting issue because we're not having intelligence as a kind of pure, free-floating thing, independent of the rest of the world. We're having intelligence in the world. Some of you might have heard about the Flynn effect, which is the observation that people's ability to solve intelligence tests have been going up rather steadily throughout the 20th century. So it was first observed in the draft tests in New Zealand, but it's roughly true in most parts of the world. And it's a fairly sizable increase. Does that mean that our grandparents were really dim? Not really. I think we would say they were about as smart as us. However, there had been a reallocation a bit of what kind of problems we're good at solving. Most of us are extremely abstract thinkers compared to people for a century back. Back then there was a lot of practical skills you needed to get through life, like handling horses. You actually needed to do that kind of interaction in order to be functional in everyday life. We have moved much more now to abstractions, being able to get computers to do what you want and handle weird stuff going on the financial market. That's actually much more relevant. So this reallocation is of course because of a changed context in our society. Today, on the back of cereal boxes, you get little fun problems to keep the kids busy. If you look carefully, you realize they are essentially intelligence tests in disguise. Our kind of IQ kind of test. And when thinking about multiple forms of intelligence, yeah, you could imagine trying to have something else, something that is much more practical, for example. Might not fit on a cereal box how to actually get horses to do something. Although once we get sufficiently interactive inks, maybe our cereal box are going to be animated, we're actually going to be manipulating virtual animals to keep the kids busy instead. That might again shift the kind of intelligence we have. So, yes, I'm very aware that intelligence is a rather fraught concept, and many people would argue maybe it doesn't even exist. But that's a bit like saying wealth doesn't exist. After all, how do you measure it? If you measure it in terms of money in the bank account, you will find some people having enormous buildings, but nothing in the bank. And some people who are very rich also have enormous debts, but yet they're flying around in the private airlines. So in the end, you can make a very crude measure. You can kind of sum up how much the taxman say they owe the government, or you can even just measure the weight of all the possessions. Those measures are exceedingly crude and might miss some weird kind of wealth. There are billionaires who like to travel around the world with just the clothes they got on the body, their laptop and a credit card, while others really want huge tracts of land. But we can still say, yeah, we kind of recognize it roughly when we see it. And of course, the causes of that wealth are interesting. We might be interested in what causes wealth to be concentrated, what causes certain kinds of wealth to grow very rapidly. Similarly, we might say, what about intelligence? What causes some people to be born with a lot of intelligence? What causes other people to have trouble acquiring human capital, even though they have a brain that is working very well? So that's something I want to aim at. Okay with this intro? Okay. Let's go on a little bit. So, many of you who have heard me talk before recognize this slide because I've kind of been using it for more than a decade by now. Just generally pointing out ways we can improve our brain. And there is a large number of ways we can do this improvement. Some of them, like in the lower left corner, are very tricky. Avoid lead in the drinking water. Get enough sleep. Exercise. Exercise turns out to be a really good way of getting insulin-like growth factors to diffuse through the body, and somehow, we don't quite know why, affect the brain, so you get neurons to sprout new connections, and they improve reading, comprehension, and math ability. It's also kind of annoying because you get sweaty and it takes time. You can kind of fool yourself into it. I got a Fitbit as a Christmas present, and now I'm walking much more because I'm getting a number telling me that I'm good. And my brain is organized in such a stupid way that I believe that the higher number correlates to something good, which fortunately it seems to do. It seems to be good for me to walk. But it's still kind of, I'm short-circuiting some of my cognitive biases here. In this case, in order to achieve something which is useful. However, there are other ways of improving your brain. Education is, of course, a classic one. It gives you 2.7 IQ points per year, at least in the basic grade. Eventually it levels off, otherwise we would be way smarter over in Oxford. Unfortunately, that leveling off probably happens rather early on. And part of that is not knowledge, it's learning how to learn. Learning skills of acquiring information or organizing information. And probably just being a stimulating environment surrounded by a lot of other kids who you have to interact with. You need to negotiate the social landscape of a schoolyard, which is a way harder problem than most of the math problems. We also have mental training methods, which can be quite powerful. So I've been collaborating with some people in Germany who are working with memory athletes. These are people who can memorize several decks of cards mixed together. One of them actually, giving a lecture about brain scans of memory athlete, started out by memorizing a deck of cards while giving his talk, and then flawlessly repeating back the order. And unfortunately, or fortunately, his results was very much that the brains of these memory athletes who can easily do this, so memorize numbers hundreds of digits long, are totally normal. It's all about the algorithm. You need to learn how to memorize this information, and then anybody in this room can do it. It's just that most of us are not really motivated to memorize decks of cards. Maybe if some of us wanted to try to make a fortune of blackjack in Las Vegas, we might want to do it. But These techniques are very powerful, and they have a long history back to antiquity, where it was actually useful to memorize entire books. But these days, of course, we can write stuff down on paper. There are other memory techniques and mental tricks that allow you to control yourself in various ways. Many of them are very powerful and actually better than much of what we can do biomedically. However, they also take a lot of effort. And it's worth recognizing that effort is actually a cost. Just like a monetary cost, the time it takes or the motivation it takes to learn something might actually be too costly for many of us. So that's of course why we're interested in finding other ways. One way to the far left is of course to use other brains. I'm going to get back to that today, and I'm mostly going to focus on the individual brain in this talk. But it's well worth noticing that stringing together brains in the right way, by having a market or a scientific community or something else, you can achieve way more powerful things than using a simple brain. And of course also get into very interesting problems when these brains malfunction collectively rather than individually. We have very interesting systemic risks when we have a group of people making decisions together that don't exist with individual decision makers. So understanding how the biases shift when we move from individuals to groups is a really important thing that I'd love to talk more about, but maybe some other time. I'm mainly going to be talking about the slightly more futuristic stuff here to the upper and the right. And the drugs and the genetic interventions and things like that. Because these ones have another interesting property. They might be possible to distribute in society in different ways, and they might also change the rules for how we think about thinking to some degree. But we shouldn't forget that even very simple things can have big effect. It turns out that dropping out of school early costs you about 1.8 IQ points. And it turns out that if you measure the IQ of students before or after the summer vacation, you find also a slight drop in IQ. Sometimes just a vacation might make you slightly dumber.
Thank you.
On the other hand, you might be happy. So there might be a trade-off. We should always remember intelligence itself might not be that valuable. I'm coming from an academic environment. We tend to think intelligence is really awesome. But most of the spam I'm getting is not about the smart drugs. It's about Viagra. You might actually value other things in life. Intelligence is instrumental. And that is, of course, why it's also interesting to think about how we distribute it, because that might tell us what things could we get from it in different distributions in society. So here is probably the closest we have right now to a proper intelligence enhancement. That's the MBAC task, which is essentially computer training of working memory. The interesting thing about it is that this is not anything that you drink or anything that affects your brain via radiation. You just sit in front of a computer and try to memorize a sequence of letters and locations, and occasionally answer what was happening 3 steps back, 5 steps back, 7 steps back. Where was that letter 9 steps back? And the important part here is not that it's a difficult task, because it is, but that the computer keeps up with you, checks how often you make errors, and gradually makes it harder until you actually need to pay attention. Then you do that every day. And unsurprisingly, you become better at it after a while, and it also seems to carry over to actually doing intelligence tests. This is probably because to many of us, working memory is the big bottleneck in our thinking. When we try to solve a typical IQ test problem, we need to juggle several facts at the same time, and we probably become better from that. It's still kind of early days, and we don't quite know how well this works for real-world applications. We just know that intelligence tests go better. We don't know whether people who actually do this also do better out in the real life. This is the general problem with many of these experiments on enhancement. We know quite well how they work in the lab, but it's expensive or sometimes tricky to get ethics approval to actually check what we do in practice. Still, given these caveats, it's interesting to notice that this is something relatively simple and very hard to regulate too. In fact, there's loads and loads of companies already selling brain training games that promise that they will prevent you from getting Alzheimer's and so on. And many of them have very, very weak scientific basis and are just overstating the claims. So there is plenty of snake oil here. We probably need a kind of enhancement consumer report to actually check this. And then, of course, we got the favorite topic of smart drugs. And in general, of course, people are much more in favor of something you can say it's a natural herbal supplement, like the ginkgo to the left, rather than some pill like the Adderall to the right. Although, of course, from a chemical standpoint, it's still molecules. So the ginkgo is probably good for you if you're a bit older and have a bit of problem with blood circulation, but it doesn't really affect the brain that strongly. Adderall is a mixture of amphetamines and certainly affects the brain. It's interesting because you get slightly different effect depending on whether you got ADHD or have a more normal brain chemistry. But one of the main effects is, of course, more energy and focusing of attention. And again, this is a bit of a trade-off. Because having a wide range of attention is quite useful if you're on the African savannah and want to look for opportunities and want to keep your eye out for predators. If you're in an office trying to write that PM to your boss, you want to focus your attention and not care too much that it's a really boring job. At that point, you might want to focus your attention. Many of these enhancers are not so much about general intellectual ability as getting your brain to do a particular task that you understand right now would be useful to do. We don't have any drug or pill that seems to promote general intelligence as far as we know. Then, of course, people are using them in a lot of very different ways. So one of my favorite examples is that in classical music, apparently a fair number of people are using beta blockers to get over stage fright. So here we're just using the calming ability to function better in a slightly weird environment. And then, of course, rather famously, Paul Erdős, the mathematician to the upper right, he took a lot of amphetamines and was one of the most productive mathematicians of last century. There is a famous case where he made a bet with a colleague who was a bit worried about him, that he could go out in a month without amphetamines. And he demonstrated, yeah, he wasn't addicted, he could do that well. But afterwards, when he took the money, he said, yeah, but you set math back a month. Which actually raises an interesting question. Do we care that those theorems he was proving were done while under the influence of amphetamine? And I think most of us say, nah, not really. They are true, eternally true, no matter how he reached the conclusion. Srinivasa Ramanujan, the Indian mathematician, claimed that the goddess Lakshmi gave him his best theorems in dreams. And we're not saying, oh, he was cheating, he was giving divine help. No, we say, oh, that's a beautiful theorem and kind of interesting story about how he claimed to have reached it. So here we only care about the output, and maybe I'm using anecdotes about the more eccentric mathematicians. On the other hand, we get a bit more worried when our students are taking drugs to do well on exams. And part of this is, of course, that we have certain rules for certain domains. We might not have any particular opinion about stage fright among classical music performers, and we might not think much about the rules surrounding mathematics. But we have a certain idea of what is supposed to be going on in school or at university. And the problem here is quite often these rules are not explicit. We don't think often about what they're actually supposed to be. So on one level, they should learn stuff. And at that point, it seems that taking an enhancer drug sounds like a great idea, because it would increase the learning ability. On another hand, we also want to measure how good they are at stuff. One reason is, of course, to check that we're actually doing good education. Another reason is, of course, relative ranking. You want to get a good grade so you can graduate cum laude and get a really nice job. Now that's a comparison, and if some people are taking enhancers and some are not, you might get an unfair comparison. This is a bit like the situation with doping in sport. People might say, well, in sport we're making a comparison of certain things, and if some people are taking enhancers, that's distorting in ways that are unrelated to what we care about it. Typically people explain it in a different way. They say it's against the spirit of sport. But what's the spirit of a university? Well, that's a rather complicated thing. Many people say, oh, the real spirit of a university is this humanistic vision of people growing, interacting with others, learning new things, questioning truths, and becoming a good member of society. Maybe a revolutionary member of society, but still kind of growing in autonomy. Okay, enhancers might both help and impair that in a very complicated manner. It doesn't give us much help on figuring out whether we should give drug tests to the student, and whether we should admonish the people who are taking the drugs or not taking the drugs. So similarly, we have similar problems, of course, when applying this in other professions. What about surgeons? There are some experiments demonstrate that surgeons on modafinil perform certain tasks slightly better. So would I want to have a surgeon who is unenhanced or enhanced? And it seems like I would have a rational reason to want the enhanced surgeon. However, there might be a problem in demanding that my surgeon is enhanced. There is some interesting work by Hannah Maslin over in Oxford about the legal implication. It seems like, yeah, it would be pretty tough actually to get legal rules in place demanding that surgeons enhance themselves. There are some corresponding cases about their need to use eyeglasses. A surgeon who ought to use eyeglasses and who aren't, can you sue him for negligence? And it turns out to be surprisingly tough. Similarly, we've got airline pilots. Again, would you like to go on a flight with an enhanced pilot or an unenhanced? And here the problem might be what enhancer is taking to. So Go pills has been used for pilots for a very long time. They're essentially amphetamine mixtures. The problem if you take a stimulant is that you get faster reactions, you're feeling more alert, but you tend to mainly use a kind of stimulus response chain rather than think carefully about what's going on. That led to a friendly fire incident in Afghanistan a few years back when some American gunship pilot shot down some enemy Canadian fighters. And when it ended up in court, the US military is on record saying amphetamines are perfectly safe, which is a hilarious thing to say. What has happened is that people have shifted over to modafinil, which actually doesn't seem to have the same kind of side effect. You think a bit more on modafinil. In fact, your reactions might become slower because you think a little bit more. But that sounds just what you want with somebody with a gunship with a lot of missiles. Similarly for the truck drivers, we might actually say, yeah, it's probably a good thing if truck drivers don't fall asleep. Ideally, they, just like surgeons, should of course get enough sleep and have a sensible schedule. But it seems very hard to get even the surgeons, who are after all a high status job that ought to have a lot of pull in the hospital administration, to get them to sleep well. And truck drivers have incentives that also mean that quite often they drive for a much longer period than they ought to, and the end result might be fatigue driving, which causes a lot of accidents. Perhaps the most interesting case is the lower right. We also see a lot of political decision making decisions under the influence of sleep, or rather sleepiness. So going 24 hours without sleep corresponds to drinking several glasses of wine. And yet we accept people going out from long negotiations in Brussels, coming out there saying, yes, we have made a decision, we have saved the euro. Now imagine if Cameron came out there, swigging from bottle. Yeah, we have saved the euro. We would not take him very seriously. And we would probably question that decision because we would say, well, it was probably not made in the best of mental states. Yet, if we tend to accept that people spend a long time at night working to show their dedication. So it's mostly a signaling thing, which is very problematic because yes, it might signal that these leaders really care about saving the euro. However, they might do that at the expense of how they save the euro. So we have interesting problems that we actually accept a lot of rather bad cognition. And maybe we should actually put a bowl of smart drugs on that table and hope they're taken from them. Okay, that was smart drugs. What else can we do? Well, actually, here is an interesting little thing, just as an aside. So this is just mainly some data, just to show that there is data, showing that there are certain smart drugs that can imitate the effects of having an enriched upbringing. So we know that rats that grow up in a boring cage, when you give them problems as adults, of course the poor rats are not doing terribly well. Their memory is worse, and the neurons in the brain actually have fewer connections. Now, if you give them a certain drug, in this case it's a cholinergic drug, you can actually get them as adults to develop more neural connection, and they do just as well as rats that grew up in a cage with other rats, interesting toys and fun stuff. It doesn't have this effect on the rats that actually had a rich childhood. So in this case it's a beautiful example of how you could actually compensate for one unfairness in life. If you start out in a very bad, impoverished environment, you might actually be able to compensate for that later on. Of course, in humans, it might still not compensate for years of missing education, because there's still information you haven't gotten. The problem is, of course, you can't pack information into a pill very effectively. So this might be a good example of a drug that could actually enhance fairness to some extent. And then, of course, we have interesting other ways of transcranial magnetic stimulation that can change plasticity in parts of the brain. Again, a relatively simple method, and a lot of people are making thinking caps of various kinds and testing it. making some of the academic researchers somewhat worried about this, because they don't really know about the long-term effects and side effects of whether you could kindle epileptic seizures. But it's fairly general tool for making parts of the cortex more plastic, so you can learn things better. Roy Cohen-Kadosh over in Oxford, for example, has famously used this to make people learn arbitrary symbols and the relations, to develop a kind of mathematical sense of them. So the symbols actually follow a certain mathematical pattern that you don't tell the test subjects about. And when you see that their cognitive biases and behavior about this symbol do indeed follow these mathematical rules, and it does happen much more fast if you stimulate the right part of the cortex. The interesting thing is this treatment lasts for only 30 minutes or so. However, what you learn during that is, of course, in your memory. So when he tested these test subjects 6 months later, they still had this kind of improved memory of the properties of these arbitrary symbols. So anything you can find on the outer part of the cortex, you can affect to some degree the TMS. So this is an area where people are playing around and coming up with all sorts of interesting things, including various Kickstarters selling stimulating devices in order to improve your computer gaming performance. They even point out that yes, this is completely legal because this is not a medical device, it's just enhancing your computer gaming performance. It's still doing that by stimulating your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, just the same areas that some researchers I know are actually studying stimulation of in order to treat depression. And they are kind of really cautious, while Focus, the company selling this device, are happily saying, don't use it more than half an hour per day. So we don't know the long-term effects. I would really like to see more about that. It might turn out that they're completely beneficial and we've been missing out on something. Or it might turn out that we really need to be cautious here. Then, of course, we've got genetic enhancement. And again, this is a classic picture, the little Doogie mouse. The Doogie mouse that overexpresses a receptor for a receptor protein for glutamate, and it improves its memory performance. Also, slightly famously, it has an increased sensitivity for a certain kind of pain. So it makes for a very kind of nice philosophical thought experiment. Would I want that enhancement and the increased aches and pains in my life? My answer is, of course, aspirin. There are ways around it. But most enhancement will have one trade-off or another. By now we have about 30 different genes we know how to modify in mice to improve their memory in various ways. It's both a question of how you acquire memory and how you forget about stuff. And of course there might be interesting questions, how much could we do to humans? And basically these interventions in particular genes, they could probably work pretty well in humans, except that I don't see many parents wanting to do gene therapy of their child in order to make them smarter, in just the sense of getting slightly better memory. There are way better methods of doing that. However, we can of course do selection. You could actually be breeding people for higher intelligence. This is somewhat politically incorrect for very good reasons. However, if we, for the moment, leave ethics totally to the side and actually start just calculating how much could we actually do if we did embryo selection, it turns out that there is you can calculate this statistically fairly well. This is from a paper by Carl Schulman and Nick Bostrom, where they show that, well, if you just have two embryos and select the one that's smartest, you take check the genome, you compare that to a lot of genomes where you have measured the IQ, and let's assume that you actually have a really good estimate of how genome maps to IQ, which is not entirely true, and right now there's a lot of noise in this, but then you could gain 4.2 IQ points. Nothing to sneeze at, but it's not enormous. However, if you had more embryos, essentially you get more bits of selective power, and you can get way more. So if you somehow generated 1,000 embryos and selected the smartest, you would get 24 IQ points, which is quite a lot. The problem here is, of course, that making 1,000 embryos, that's very tough. Even in a test tube, you need a lot of eggs and so on. It's messy. You could, of course, also imagine running a little society and selecting for the smartest to breed with them. Again, it turns out that if you do strong selection for 5 generations, you get about 65 IQ points, which is enormous. Except that now you need to motivate everybody involved in this experiment and outside that they don't bomb you for behaving like this. However, there might be even more radical methods based on stem cells that could get enormous amounts of selective power. The interesting thing here is that in the West, we regard genetic selection for intelligence as really bad. And the reason is, of course, what happened in the eugenics movement, which was based on, the reason it was wrong was three main reasons. First, a lot of their science actually was wrong. They didn't actually know what they're doing. But second, of course, they had a very centralized idea. Somebody knew what was good and they decided on that, and everybody had to follow that rule. The problem is, of course, if that rule happens to be wrong, in that case, all of society is moving in the wrong direction. And the third and most important part, it was also coercive. There have been discussions now about whether we might be getting to liberal eugenics, where parents are actually selecting children based on various traits, and that is leading to a kind of eugenic society. This is an interesting one because now there is no coercion, and there's none of that centralized. We might still argue whether some of the science is good enough to actually matter. We're already seeing that to some extent, that they're selecting against certain disabilities and certain genetic diseases. So if I happen to know that I'm heterozygous for fructose intolerance, so if I were to get a child, I would want to make sure that the embryo doesn't have 2 copies of that gene, because then they would actually be in trouble. So for the reason that I might care about my child, I would of course select against that particular gene. We don't see that much positive selection that parents right now are trying to make smarter kids, or blue-eyed kids and blonde kids and so on. Partially because it's rather expensive to do this kind of diagnostic. And it's not that pleasant compared to the natural way of making kids using test tubes. However, it's well worth recognizing that in other cultures, for example in Southeast Asia, the idea that giving your children the best possible start in life are actually much more acceptable. So we might actually see that in other cultures we are going to see more uses of this technology. In particular, Beijing Genomics research consortia are very happily sequencing the genomes of the 10,000 brightest students they could find in China, and are trying to look for rare genetic variants that correspond to intelligence. This is something that they, of course, if they find something, will happily publish worldwide, while in the West, even mentioning such a project would make most research councils say, no, go away, we don't want to go there. So we're reaching an interesting situation where we're getting these technologies, and of course if somebody would be starting to use it, we would have a subpopulation, maybe small, maybe larger, of people selected for intelligence. I'm going to get back to this to some extent, because there is an interesting problem here. And that's, of course, do we actually want to select for intelligence primarily? And I would guess no. First, we probably want to go for health. Intelligence is one of the general purpose goods we might want to give to kids. So I'm not going to get too much into the ethics in particular about genetic selection of kids, because that's another lecture on its own. It's an awesome and interesting and controversial topic, but basically you have trade-offs when doing selection. If you actually are selecting between embryos, you want to maximize several good things. And you cannot select for all of them simultaneously. With some future form of genetic engineering, maybe you could just put it in. But that's very separate from what we currently know we can do in the long run. Normally, it turns out to be rather hard to individually modify intelligence. People have been looking for intelligence genes and found that there is no gene that is common that has more than 1% effect on intelligence. It's not like there is a little genius gene that gives you 100 extra IQ points if you happen to have the right version. Most of them having a very small effect, and quite often they seem to sum up together. You need to be just lucky to have the plus versions, then you're smart. So that's also why it has not been possible to claim that, oh, if we just put this gene into kids, they would become geniuses. And the real problem is, of course, we actually don't know how a genome leads to you becoming a real genius in society, because quite a lot of geniuses also need a lot of support in the right environment when growing up. So there is a data problem here, which is limiting the applicability of this approach. We need to actually not just measure the genes of people, but also see how were they educated, what were they stimulated by, how did that fit together with the personality. There is a lot more information and data mining to be done here. Okay, so just to sum up here, boosting general intelligence, it's tough. That might actually require things like those genetic selection mechanisms. Some tricks like the MVAC task might work to some degree. We know much better how to enhance particular faculties, a particular piece of our cortex, or a particular thing like alertness or memory. We're much better at dealing with them. But the higher up we go in this hierarchy of cognitive ability, the bigger the rewards are. If I have really good memory, that's slightly useful for getting a good job and having a good life. Being smart is way more useful. Of course, I might then select a job where my memory is actually useful and I care much more about it. But generally, we want to figure out better ways of getting the general intelligence. Now, the real problem for us is, of course, that we can't tell which of these techniques are going to become powerful. But let's just assume that we're getting technologies that are going to improve some of a higher order ability. How should we then be handling them? But now I think we should have a little break to ask questions and maybe get a briefer. So, that's it. You have a question?
Yeah. I think that maybe two things. One is what you would call generalized intelligence improvement, which is different from actually just being able to focus. And maybe the conditions for actually improving generalized intelligence. The other, I think, which I'm slightly confused by, is whether or not you're actually making an argument for intelligence improvement on a widespread scale. So obviously, sort of two different things, but you know, intelligence on a widespread scale might be, for example, not necessarily doing positive things rather than actually removing negative things, like pervasive neurotoxins in the environment. So rather than actually sort of looking at incremental ways in which we can actually trigger through biohacking, it might actually be just as useful to work with environmental biologists, for example.
Yeah, so suppose we lived in a perfect environment. We wouldn't be much smarter than we currently are. However, there are also these negative genetic things. Those hundreds of genes affecting our intelligence, many of them are probably decreasing it slightly. So if you just manage to turn every gene to its version that is improving intelligence, which is part of natural variation, you would get somebody who's way smarter than the average normal person. Generally, I think environmental changes, they can only go so far. Just like biological changes also have upper limits. The nerves cannot conduct messages faster than about 100 meters per second. And that's if you have really thick myelin insulation. Most are way slower. It's no way we can actually move signals faster in our nervous system because that's how it's built. So there are upper limits to biological intelligence improvement. Some of these selection models suggest that actually they could be way higher than we normally think, while most of the cognitive enhancer drugs give you 10 to 20% improvement of one of the particular tasks. So I'm interested in this talk not so much in any particular enhancement as getting to the ethical question how we should be trying to distribute them in society. But I agree with you, it's interesting to think about different ways we might want to achieve that. Quite often people tend to assume that there's something fundamentally different between a social intervention, a psychological intervention, and a biological intervention. I disagree. All of them are changing neural networks. The social intervention is changing neural networks among a lot of people. The psychological one does it by you talking to somebody. And the biological one is doing it by directly adding some chemicals or stimulating some neurons. Some of them might be cheaper or easier or safer or might be more politically acceptable, and that is a relevant question. For example, I would be very surprised if any Western society would accept any kind of breeding program of humans for the next 50 years or 100 years. We simply had too bad experience over the past century to accept that, and liberal democracy would strongly resist it. On the other hand, social interventions have a very good name, largely because people don't measure very carefully how well they actually work. When we become better at measuring how well they work, we might actually become quite more selective. Not just because we find that some interventions actually are not very useful, but we discovered, oh, there are actually side effects. People tend to think about side effects when you talk about drugs. Nobody talks about the side effects of education. But of course, there are bound to be loads of side effects. It's literally warping our brains in interesting ways. But nobody's actually checking in what ways we get warped by school. Okay, let's see. You over there, and then you, and then you. Yeah.
So you mentioned a few times motivation as a factor that's not perhaps studied as much. But Do you know of any research that studies motivation in particular? For example, comparing performance on some IQ tests, given the same results, but maybe the neurochemistry might be different with individuals with different motivations. More like, because it seems like if there were drugs or treatments to enhance in some way intrinsic motivation, that might make for a much larger impact. And it might not be something mysterious.
Yeah. So far I haven't seen any really good papers on enhancement of motivation in that sense, at least not on IQ test. There are a few nice sociological papers about enhanced use that show that it has a strong link to motivation. Because many of the smart drugs students take, they're stimulants, and they might actually be more useful to give you study motivation than actually making you smarter in studying. But that's of course still a useful reason to take them. In particular, modafinil, which is kind of my favorite drug to talk about, there is a very nice result from Barbara Sahakian's lab where they looked at performance under modafinil. And they also checked how much people like doing the task. And this is a kind of boring psychological task. You're sitting in a psychology lab and kind of pressing buttons on a computer. And people enjoy doing it much more when they took modafinil, which is good for motivation. You can imagine sitting in a boring room and doing an intelligence test. And again, if the drug makes you enjoy it, well, then you're probably going to do better off here. So I think managing motivation is really a potentially very powerful thing. I think in many cases we need more motivation enhancement than we need intelligence enhancement. But we also need to kind of control what we're motivated to do. I think most of us are really scared if some other people could motivate us to do something we don't care about. We want to control the motivation. Okay, then you?
Isn't it more efficient at this point to use silicon intelligence rather than changing biological intelligence? And with unknown side effects, whereas silicon intelligence is more effective. I use machines. So like 200 years ago, we didn't try to make ourselves go faster. We invented machines to make us go faster. So rather than trying to make us smarter, why don't we use machines to make us smarter?
The problem is, of course, making us a smarter machine is a fairly hard problem.
So much easier now. I mean,
it's getting easier, and that in itself also, of course, cause for certain kinds of concern. And outsourcing our thinking to machines in the right way is enormously useful. I don't know if you remember how it was running through a library trying to figure out where is the information I'm searching for. Now you're just Googling it. And you have various other ways of outsourcing time management and a lot of skills. The problem is, of course, these are very particular ones. They're kind of low-level things. It's very easy to make some of those lower boxes, like detecting when somebody has written something you're interested in. That is easy to do. It's much harder to have an answer from Google. What is this about? We don't have that technology yet. If we develop that, and of course many people are working very hard on developing it, there's loads of money in it. It would probably help us if it can also be integrated well. And that is the problem. Some of you might remember the Microsoft paperclip that just popped up and said, oh, it looks like you're writing a letter. Would you like some help? And it was immensely annoying for most people because it interrupted the process. It didn't have a right social framing, so it interacted with you in the wrong way. Although it was an awesome help tool in many ways, it actually failed because it was interfacing with you in the wrong way. Meanwhile, a really smart device, like some wearable computers, are aiming at getting integrated with how you function in a clever way, so you don't think about it. We're just there and we're just functioning. That's the dream for any smartphone maker. It's also extremely hard because it's not just technology, it's design. It's understanding how people think and integrating yourself with their way of thinking. So that's very tough. I do think we can offload a lot of cognition to silicon. But it also turns out to be rather tricky because some of the core parts of cognition, the ones that actually make our lives go better, as I discussed in the first part, they are very hard to get there. Human pattern recognition, human strategic thinking, they are among the hardest to add to a smartphone. Okay, I have one question over there. Well, you first, then Rohit, and then I think I will continue. Yeah.
Is Facebook usage, which has increased everybody's social interaction, IQ enhancing?
I don't know. I think there is two effects here. On one hand, it's distracting. A lot of people are getting distracted because we constantly check for updates. So in terms of effective intelligence, a lot of us are getting dumber because we're just getting interrupted because somebody's poking us or whatever it's called. I'm not a Facebook user. It's a Google+. There's nobody there. It's very quiet. On the other hand, managing a social network is really tricky. When you think about it, we are very social beings, and keeping track of people takes a fair part of our brains. The one reason reality soaps are so interesting is that you're kind of playing at the primate tribal instincts. It's important what alliances exist in a little crowd and how to keep track of people. Facebook allows us to keep track of a larger group. So in a sense, we are getting socially smarter along certain dimensions. I think you might argue that, yeah, it's only a particular, rather narrow kind of social smart. We might be missing out on the deeper relationships and things like that, but it's really great for maintaining all those rather weak links. It's a bit like LinkedIn, which is more about kind of business contact, but yeah, you can have an enormous range of extremely weak links going far in the world, which is quite useful for many people's careers. You could imagine a Facebook of the future that also helps you have deep friendships. I have no clue how to do that, and if I had, I wouldn't tell you because I would be rushing out to make my own startup and become a CEO. But you can certainly imagine that. So we shouldn't think that the only game in town is the biological brain. Software is going to play an enormous role, and our ability to interface with software in a clever way is also important. If you think about the old-fashioned phones, the ones with a rotary dial, the user interface is totally crazy. Any teacher in a user interface class would tell you, no, you can't design a device like that. People can't learn it, it's too complicated. Which is true, but people were motivated to learn it and could use it fairly well. And similarly, we can learn almost anything. However, if it's easy to learn and easy to integrate in life, then it's going to be more widespread use. But if it's also very desirable, people will also learn how to use it. The World of Warcraft has a horrible user interface, again, from a strict user interface standpoint. It's complicated and hard to learn, but since it's such a fun game, people will be motivated to learn it. Okay, Rohit, as a final question in this question section.
Great talk so far, sir. And you've talked a lot about, if you like, chemical, genetic and electronic enhancements to improve cognition. Have you also looked at any of the research that's going on around things like mindfulness, yoga and spirituality, and how they seem to be, in tests that are done, they seem to be having quite a deep impact?
Yeah. So the deep impact here is also very subtle, because some of that is also the non-cognitive side. Again, motivations, paying attention to the work, or even affecting your own values. So one thing that seems to happen when you do the proper kind of meditation is that you're reformatting your cortical network. You're getting rid of some connections that shouldn't be there. You might be getting a better level of arousal and so on. All extremely useful for living a good life. I have co-authored a review paper about non-pharmacological cognitive enhancement, and we have a pretty big section on meditation. And it's one of those annoying things, because among us co-authors, we all know that could be 10 times longer, and we still only scratch at the surface. The problem is, of course, I need to learn mindfulness. When will I get the time? That's why the pill has such an appeal, because it's instant. But it's also lacking in information. The reason mindfulness meditation is so powerful is, in a sense, it's getting fine-tuned to who I am. And one of the problems I foresee if we were to use smart drugs widely in society is that you actually need to fine-tune what drug to use. I find modafinil useful and stimulating and focusing. I have a friend who is deeply annoyed because he just gets anxious and depressed if he tries it. And that's because our brains work slightly differently. What enhancer drug should he be taking, if any? Well, he probably should run through a test battery and have a psychologist measure him. That's going to be expensive and take time, and again, that's problematic. Okay, so I would like to now jump over to the next step, because otherwise we're not getting to the equality and justice, although this is rather fun topics too. As you can guess, I can go on for hours about this. So I'm going to jump over some of the questions about the limit. Just, it's worth noticing, besides that our brains are squishy biology and cannot be overclocked arbitrarily. We might not want to change who we are. We don't want to hurt others and so on. And it actually turns out that many people don't want to enhance stuff that feel too central to themselves. So this is my favorite paper in all of literature on enhancement ethics, where we just asked people, would you like to take a drug that enhanced a particular trait, and checked how fundamental that trait seemed to be to the respondent. So people were kind of happy to take a hypothetical pill that gave them better language ability or wakefulness. On the other hand, a kindness pill, only 9% wanted to take it. Maybe more people ought to want to take it. However, many of us probably think that, yeah, I'm probably kind enough. Or maybe everybody else should be taking the kindness pill. Deep down, I think what's going on here is, of course, we don't want to change who we really are. And we might feel that maybe I become inauthentic if I take the kindness pill. While language, that's just a tool, that's something instrumental for my success in life. Also, if you ask people whether they would like to ban enhancements and so on, it turns out that on the x-axis you have the willingness to take the stuff, and on the vertical axis, the willingness to ban it. So the stuff that were kind of core, that nobody really wanted, people don't really care much about whether it should be banned or not. People are fairly okay about something that got rid of absent-mindedness, problems with concentration. That's actually a good thing. And being able to talk foreign language, that's probably a nice thing. We shouldn't ban that at all. That's making society better. Meanwhile, the kind of competitive stuff, like music ability and rote memory, people were both interested in getting that pill and banning it. Which also hints that we're kind of rather messy in what we actually want to believe here. So now we're getting over to the interesting question, what the heck is fairness? And the problem here is, of course, that there are a lot of philosophers have been working on it, so it makes my head spin. I work in the philosophy department, but that doesn't mean I understand very much, which is probably a requirement, actually. But basically, the main question in distributive justice is, what is it that we should be distributed, among who, and in what way? So in this case, we're going to be talking about essentially well-functioning neural networks. How do we improve the function of neural networks? But the people involved, of course, well, are they us in this room, or the current generation, or future generation in general? And then, of course, we might discuss, well, how much should we take from people who don't want to give away something in order to give to somebody else? And there are various moves here. So the egalitarian approach is saying that, well, you need equality. And this is, of course, what equality is something that you can go on endlessly about. Typically, you tend to stuff that you can compare easily, like wealth, which, as I mentioned earlier, actually isn't at all easy to compare. If I have a big bank account and you have a huge tract of land, it's not clear who's wealthiest. But we can discuss quite a lot about that, what would be equality. So typically here, the big thing is equality of opportunity. Everybody should have the same chance of trying to live a good life. And in some places you have also ideas of equality of outcome. And in the end, you should all earn about equally much money. Very popular in Sweden. Of course, in Sweden we would immediately say, no, it's actually equality of opportunity, but then we're going to tax the people who make too much a lot. In order, of course, to help the worst off. Which then is very counter to the meritocratic view of equality, which says that wealth and social status should come to those who have merit, who happen to work hard for it, or have the right kind of noble birth, or, and that's not very popular these days, of course, but some people believed in it, or ideas like, yeah, you work for something, in that case you should have it. This is also a little bit linked to ideas of historical justice that suggest that, yeah, if I fairly buy something from somebody who's fairly acquired it, then it's mine fairly. So these ones are obviously most relevant for thinking about distributing stuff. It's not obvious, actually, how to apply that at all to enhancing brains. We also have an important thing, so this is the philosopher John Rawls, who is kind of a titan of thinking about equality and justice. Who argue that, yeah, the really important thing is actually that it should also be impartial. Quite often Lady Justice is shown as being blind or having a blindfold. She doesn't care about who you are, just everybody should be treated equally. That idea that some have noble blood and should be treated differently, That's very different from our modern concept of human dignity and equality. But of course, impartiality doesn't mean everybody gets the same. It could be just a random distribution. We could have a big lottery of stuff. In fact, that is what Rawls suggested about enhancement. In some of his later writings, he was thinking about that it's slightly unfair that some people are born with really great brains and other people are having mental impairment. Right now, there's nothing we can do about it. But if there was some way of dealing with it, but it was very expensive, so we couldn't give it to everyone, we might still distribute it fairly, simply by randomly selecting who got it. So he would argue that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system for liberty for all. That is, you should have the ability to build your life, but it must be compatible with everybody else. And here, most of the Western liberal tradition would agree. John Stuart Mill argued that, yeah, we should be free to do stuff as we want without harming others, or expressed in a more formal way, I have my rights end where your rights begin. So we each have rights to what we're doing. Now the interesting thing is Rawls argue that, yeah, we can actually accept inequalities if it actually helps the least advantage. So if a society with a few super geniuses actually is good for the people who are rather dim with it, because the super geniuses are making everybody so well off for producing so awesome music, entertainment, or inventions, then it might actually be okay that some people are way different. But generally you want an equal opportunity. So if there is a super genius pill like in the movie Limitless, you should probably, according to Rawls, have a lottery to give it to people rather than select somebody who already is really smart. Meanwhile, the meritocrat would say, no, you give it to the really smart people, while Robert Nozick and the historical justice people say, no, the people can buy it, because they got the money fairly, and they can now buy it fairly, so they should be getting the pill. Then, of course, you have the utilitarians who would argue, no, we should calculate what makes everybody best off. If we can figure out that giving it to David will really improve the world the most, then David should have it. How to calculate that is, of course, a little problem. But the interesting thing is, why would we want to have equality? I'm rather fond of an argument that a friend of mine, Nick Beckstead, came up with. He pointed out that if we're talking about different stuff or different opportunities, if I have some of these opportunities, I can use them to do what I want. I have preferences for how the world should work, what I want to do, how I want things to turn out. You have different preferences. In many cases, we all agree on things, and then there is no problem. But some preferences are about me. I want to have a good meal tonight. I want to read an interesting book before going to bed, and so you might want to do something else. And you might not care too much about my book and my meal. So the important thing is, if these opportunities are unequally distributed, then those who have a lot of opportunities, they're definitely going to get their preferences. They're going to get the exact meal they want. They're going to get the book they want. While if the rest of us have fewer opportunities, we are actually going to be less able to get what we want. Fewer preferences in the world are going to get satisfied if it's a very unequal distribution. It might be that everybody actually has enough, and then Bill Gates got loads more opportunities and he's not using them very effectively. And maybe that could be all right. But generally, according to Nick's approach, we should actually spread them out more equally. Another important thing is, of course, that if we can't do anything about the situation, we normally say this is not an ethics problem. If some people are born smart and some people are born dim with it, well, that's the way it is. We might want to help the dim people, but that's about it. Now, suppose the reason they're born smart and dim with it is because of something we can change. Now it becomes an ethical problem. For example, men live a slightly shorter lifespan than women for basic biological reasons. This is not normally regarded as a big ethical problem. It's not like we're screaming, but why is the NHS not doing something for the poor males? Because, well, it's the way things are. Now, if that is possible to modify, because those underlying biological factors could be changed, then it would turn into an interesting ethics problem, and now there probably would be questions in Parliament about it. The interesting thing here from a transhumanist perspective is that we want to control or modify ourselves. which means that a lot of things that in the past were not ethical problems and were not questions of justice become questions of justice. By enabling enhancement, for example, of cognition, we might actually create some situation where stuff that's presently not unjust becomes unjust. If there is an intelligence enhancement pill, suddenly it becomes an unjust, it might be unjust that some people don't get it. In the world where there was no pill, everything was just neutral. Now, I would argue it's still a better world where that pill exists, because now some people are going to be moving up. And we might even be figuring out the right distribution of pills to make everybody, or at least a lot of people, happy. And of course, we should not forget that there are complicated loops here. Education, intelligence, your social environment, they all affect each other. And we might again want to think about that pill, where do we put it into this big cycle where it does the most good. And again, if you're feeling utilitarian, you can start doing really awesome calculations about this. I had great fun showing that you can see it as an eigenvalue problem in a multidimensional vector space of goods. It doesn't help very much because it's too abstract, but basically you can try to optimize for the consequences. Again, convincing everybody else that you've done the right calculation is going to be very tough unless you're very enhanced. So, where do we end up here? What is the fair distribution of brain? So, first of all, it seems that we actually do care about our absolute cognitive ability. We could imagine an anti-enhancement pill. You could put it in drinking water. We all got 10 IQ points dumber. Would that be a good idea? I don't think anybody really believes that. In fact, it seems like it would make the world really worse off, because we would have more accidents, and if there are some big threats like an asteroid coming, we would be way less able to handle that. There is some kind of absolute effect here. If we're 10 IQ points smarter, yeah, maybe a lot of that effect is relative, so people would still be competing for the same jobs, but we would probably be way better at deflecting asteroids. So it seems like the reversal test, thinking about removing something rather than enhancing it, actually suggests that, yeah, we want to go in the direction of more intelligence. And again, as Rolf said, even if it's hard to distribute, we might find ways of doing that by using a lottery or something else. You can also do it in other ways. You could, for example, tax enhancement. So either those enhancement pills, you buy them and you pay a bit of tax on it, and that goes to giving enhancement pills to the worst off. Or you might have a high tax rate for people who are really enhanced. That would be the very Swedish approach. In general, it seems like, would it be a better world if we all had the same intelligence? So that's harder to tell. Sometimes you get a very quick intuitive response, like a world where everyone were dumber. That seems intuitive to be a worse one. Would a world where we're all equally smart be a better or worse place? We don't seem to really get a feeling that would be much different. But I think in practice, of course, as we've been arguing a bit before, real intelligence is not just one thing. There are actually quite a lot of different forms of intelligence. So if everybody had the same combination of musical, the mathematical, and linguistical intelligence, I think the world would be way worse off, because we would be solving the problems in the same way. It's not like we are better off because some people are dim and some people are smart. It's rather that we're better off because people have different ways of solving problems, and that allows us to solve global problems in a better way. So we can play around with scenarios like this and thinking about, would it be much better if we got rid of all people below 18 IQ? They are just got enhanced, so they have 80 plus intelligence. That seems to be a better world. Would it be an even better world if people with really high IQ got super high IQ? That seems trickier to argue. They are very productive, but depending on what kind of society you have, the benefits diffuse in different ways. I think in general, what really matters, if we think about the ethics of society, is the bulk, most people. And there I think our intelligence is a limit for equality of opportunity. If you're smart, you can see many more opportunities. You can think about more jobs you could want to take. Maybe become a postman, maybe become an astronaut. The more intelligence you have, the more opportunities you have. It might be tougher to choose between them, of course. But you also have a better chance of being smart at judging them. And it's also an interesting thing that you can find different ways of comparing yourself to others. quite a lot of people only care about social status or money. But as you get smarter or more educated, you realize actually you can care about intellectual achievement or artistic achievement or be really good at World of Warcraft. There are actually many different ways you can have a good and fulfilling life. And the smarter you are, the better you are at noticing these different ones. This is very important because if social status is the only thing there is to life, it's a zero-sum game. If somebody has to be on top, somebody has to be on bottom, and as people jockey about for social status on this ladder, this total sum doesn't change. However, some people realize that that doesn't matter. I can jump to this other ladder where I get to be on top. I'm the best World of Warcraft player in the room, or something like that. That's actually not true. I don't play World of Warcraft. I think I know who is way better than me here. But in any case, intelligence actually allows you to compete with other smaller groups and find fulfillment in different ways. And I think this is really important for human growth. So, another interesting thing here, since I think I'm running out of time, is to start thinking about the effect of different enhancement. It's not like any enhancement in general will push society in a particular way. We have a lot of different enhancement and enhancement styles that are moving us in different ways. So there's some enhancements that are probably positive for society and the individual, and those we should just promote. And I think actually quite a lot of cognitive enhancement are just there. The really bad ones are the ones that actually are not good for the people taking them, and they're not good for society. You could imagine giving growth hormone to kids so they grow to be tall as adults. This is socially good for them, because being the tallest person in the room, especially if you're male, tends to give you a social advantage. The problem is if everybody's getting taller, well, nobody's actually winning anything, and we're just going to be bumping into the door jams all the time. So this is a case where you only have a relative advantage, and people are actually getting health problems for no gain whatsoever. So then you have the interesting situation where you might have an enhancement that's good for society, but maybe it's slightly bad for the individual, like the kindness pill. It might be good if we took a kindness pill, but it might be even better for me if I don't take it, and I'm surrounded by really kind people. Now, the same thing might actually be true for some of the other enhancement drugs. I mentioned earlier the nice effects on GDP for intelligence. So imagine it was an intelligence enhancement pill, but let's say 1 in 1,000 people got bad side effects from it, because real drugs have side effects. In that case, I might also want to not take the pill and be surrounded by a really smart society. It's almost as good as a kind society. We can also get the opposite situation, where the enhancement is good for me but bad for others. You could imagine a sociopathy pill that may be really good at the stock market but rather ruthless. Okay, if you're in the city, you might want to take that pill and do really well, at least during working hours. But it would probably not be very good for society. So, analyzing different enhancements in this way will actually tell you a lot of useful things about what we might want to aim for. So in general, it seems like looking at enhancement and work in competitive jobs like athletes, it's probably not a very good idea to enhance them unless we just want to see people run really fast. The competition itself might actually be what you care about, and that just gets distorted. In the high risk and high stress jobs, you actually want to enhance people so they can do things more safely. This is also relevant for a lot of jobs that require extended awareness or shift work and stuff like that. Then we have jobs like high responsibility professions, like doctors and pilots, where it's really important that people are at the utmost of their ability because others' lives depend on it. And then we have this thing about meeting entry standards. If you want to be a particle physicist, you better be fairly smart so you can understand quantum field theory. So there, enhancement would have a democratizing effect. If you could actually enhance yourself so you could learn quantum field theory, more of us could get the coveted positions at CERN. There would be more competition among the particle physicists. Then the original particle physicists might not like that. However, I think in a sense of having more people who could get into these nice jobs might be a good thing. Also for diversity, it might be important to get more different kinds of people in. What I think is really interesting is if enhancement could give us ability to get into new professions because we get new abilities. If people could perceive different parts of the spectrum, that might actually be helpful in some jobs. if people can think in ways that we currently can't do, either because of software, because of the differences in brains, that might actually give us new abilities as a society that would be really useful. And then generally, of course, getting better range for the low performers. Overall, it seems like the enhancement is going to change our jobs most where a small increase a big effect. So that's typically where it's competition or some kind of threshold effect, or where it actually you have a particular talent that matters a lot. In many jobs, however, we need a lot of different talents. If you want to be a good academic, yes, you need to be smart enough to understand what you're talking about, but then you need to be able to explain it well too. And then you need to be able to survive interminable meetings. These are very, very different skills. And many jobs, of course, require even more things. And typically we solve that by having different people working together as a team, which might suggest that enhancement of teamwork might be way more important than the individual stuff. So, in general, I believe that we're most in the win-win square. And I think, in general, that enhancements of genetic material and so on are going to be very limited because they take too long time. We're much faster with our silicon development. We're much faster with nanotechnology than genetic selection. So there's going to be a fair bit of competition here between humans and machines. And it's our human ability to adapt that is really giving us an edge compared to computers in many jobs. We can change strategy. We can come up with new strategy. We can realize this is actually a stupid job. I'm going to switch profession. Machines don't do that generally. If they do, we generally think they're broken. At the point where machines actually seriously start thinking about changing professions, we have another problem. So it seems like what we actually want to achieve here is to get certain of these general flexibilities that are very human and amplify them. While the other stuff, a lot of the specific stuff, we can actually leave to the machines. Now, I'm very aware that I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to run past a few things, ignoring that, but generally thinking about a society of Einstein. So this is the Solvay conference in 1927, and some of you who recognize the faces can read the names will notice that this is a kind of a rather impressive crowd. Imagine a society where most people are about this smart. It's essentially unimaginable. Just as our society is in many ways totally unimaginable for somebody from the Middle Ages. One reason is, of course, that we're cheating by actually having a global civilization where anybody coming up with a good idea can instantly transmit it to everybody else who can pretend they had the idea. Thanks to Wikipedia, we're way smarter than we actually are. That sentence doesn't actually make logical sense, but what I meant was, thanks to Wikipedia, we can of course have an effective ability to at least know things, and to some degree solve things, much better than what we can do using an individual biological brain. Now, the interesting thing here is that the costs of this kind of technology depends very much on what kind of devices there are. And generally, I think what we should worry about when getting to equality and fairness is whether it's gadgets and pills versus services. So you can imagine gadgets like some cool glasses that give you instant Wikipedia access or a smart drive, or some service like going to Oxford or going to some enhancement spa where we massage your brain in the right way to give you the right level of mindfulness. The costs of drugs generally come down exponentially over time. Once the patents expire, go way down. You can manufacture molecules cheaply. However, the problem here is, of course, that the cost of services tend to go up because you need to pay the salary of the professors or the nurses. So I would say that I wouldn't be too worried about an enhancement that's in the form of a gadget, even if it's really expensive. I would be worried about it if it requires either a long time commitment, so you need to spend some of your time, which is worth a part of your salary, or somebody else needs to give you the instructions, so it's a service. Because then it's likely to be expensive, then it's going to be hard to pay for. We can still pay for services in our society. We think schooling is so great that we force all kids to go through it, despite it being super expensive and taking a lot of time. But it's regarded as good enough that we should actually pay for it on taxes. Now, if we could automate schooling in various ways, things would become much better, because then we might be moving towards the lower left diagram instead. And of course, there are interesting ideas here on online courses. I think we have seen absolutely nothing yet about how to do really 21st century education. But so far, education is tough. And I would warn against any enhancement that would have a strong service component. I think we have a moral duty, actually, to try to turn it into a gizmo or gadget. Incidentally, this is why I think one of the professions that's most important to automate as much as possible is medicine. We have to have a moral duty to try to turn that into gadgets and gizmos, because that's the only way it can become cheap enough that everybody can get access to really good healthcare. So this is a really moral reason to try to build the Autodoc. So please start working on that. Yeah, I don't have the time to get into more of a competition against the real artificial intelligence, and I don't have the time to get too much into the question of to the time course, but basically it seems like even if stuff start out expensive, it tends to come down in price. So that typically means that even if only the elite can afford to get that particular enhancement, and then inequality will be growing at first, and gradually the enhancement will become cheaper, and then everybody will have, so inequality will go down. So these curves, of course, is a measure of inequality in simulated societies. There is one way you can get growing inequality. That's, of course, if the enhancement makes the best of so much better that now they get even better off, so they buy even more enhancement. So you could imagine that Bill Gates would be the smartest man in the world because he could buy all the brains. Now, I think this is unlikely to happen with biological enhancement. It might happen if it was about artificial intelligence. So we might again want to think a little bit about artificial intelligence and especially how it enhances power in society. But again, that's a very separate talk. If you have a more realistic thing that, yeah, you might be buying all the latest gadgets and taking all the latest smart drugs and trying all the memory tricks, but there are diminishing returns, then you actually get a reduction of inequality in the long run. The reason is that first the rich people are enhancing themselves, and then they essentially reach a threshold. And then the rest catches up, and you actually get a smaller distribution. People are more equal in their intelligence, although they might be using for very different things. Of course, as we have now a smarter society, that might actually be moving ahead at a brisk clip, and, so we don't know whether that curve is going to continue like that. And of course, the diffusion in different countries of enhancement might also be very different. This is the amount of mobile money users in Africa. So the smartphone is an amazing piece of technology, really complex, and it's of course gone down exponentially in price. It's also a platform for doing interesting things like banking, which is one of the key problems in many countries that have the undeveloped banking systems and a lot of corruption. So the fact that cell phones are now really widespread in Africa is a good thing, and it's also leading to a lot of banking being done, which is really helping a lot of poor people. But the curious thing is also how different it is in different countries. And this has to do with culture, with the government rules, some regulations, and what mobile phone carriers happen to be there. You get very different branches, and of course some of these systems work in different and incompatible ways, so you get essentially different cultures. It's a bit like China got Baidu while we got Google. In that case, we also correspond both a language and political barrier. But we might see that the diffusion of enhancement might go very differently in different parts of the world, because based on local culture, local needs, and the infrastructure that you can use for that. Diversity, of course, is also important. I kind of cherish diversity being a beetle collector. And we should recognize that there are enhancements that have nothing to do with earning money or being successful by the standard measures. That monkey got a new gene for color perception and can see a color that it previously couldn't see. Stellark, the performance artist, he's built himself a third arm as art. My friend Todd got an implanted magnet so he can sense magnetic fields. You might argue, what's the use of sensing magnetic fields? And I would argue, well, it might be an existential thing. You might just want to experience that sector of the world. Previously, no humans could sense magnetic fields. Now at least Todd and a few others can sense it. Maybe there are beautiful magnetic fields out there that we ought to know about and try to get. Or maybe it's actually a pointless thing, but somebody needs to dip into that pool. Similarly, ultraviolet light. Maybe there are beautiful patterns of ultraviolet light in this room. We cannot know that unless we try it out. So it's an interesting situation here that We might want enhancement that also extend us in new directions. And they're not easy to capture in this normal idea about justice and equality. It's not like it's unfair that Todd got a magnet and we haven't, because most of us are rather thankful we don't have to do surgery on our fingers. It's rather that it's a good thing that some people have this ability and can tell us about it. I don't have the time for this. So this is the boring conclusion. I'm going thinking about what the key points from a transhumanist perspective would be. And one seems to be that we shouldn't be treating people in far-off countries differently from people nearby. I think most people recognize, yeah, people are people. But if we shouldn't be disregarding people far away in space, what about time? And I think it's true that, yeah, we should think of people in the future also as having the same values. So we shouldn't exactly sacrifice the poor for the future for the poor in the present. There are some people who argue we shouldn't be doing this kind of enhancement technology because we're going to make things unfair. I think that's untrue. In the long run, we're all going to be better off, even if it even temporarily makes it unfair that some have the enhancements. And I think in many cases we do have rather strong win-win situations. I also think that from a transhumanist standpoint, if you start reading up in the Transhumanist Manifesto and the Transhumanist Declaration, one key idea is that we want to explore the bigger space of possible modes of being, the post-human modes of being, seeing those magnetic fields and whatever might be outside there. Some of that is probably very, very valuable. A lot of it is going to be just as much junk as other parts of the human condition. But we need to be able to explore that. The declaration makes a big point that we should have wide access. And I think this is not just for the fairness reasons or because it maximizes some kind of utility, but it's actually most important for learning more. Because we actually don't know what directions are really the best. We're not smart enough for that. And we're not going to be smart enough for that even if we enhance ourselves endlessly. Because the universe is always going to be slightly trickier than we believe in. Partially because it's full of other smart beings making the universe more complicated. I also think that speeding up progress is probably a smart idea because it actually reduces the impact of inequality. The only exception would be if it turned out that there would be this kind of compounding effect of having great intelligence. In that case, speeding up speed might be bad. I think this is unlikely, but it's worth investigating. I also think that we're going to need a really tolerant world because people are going to go in very different directions, both individually and as societies. And that's going to lead to interesting problems if we, for example, in the West say, no way, no genetic selection for intelligence. And then there's some bright Chinese students show up and they have very clear evidence of genetic tampering. Should we be turning our way at the border because we got an illegal genome? Hey, that sounds rather racist, actually. But on the other hand, if some people are enhancing in some ways that we find deeply unethical, how do we handle that? I think building the tolerant world system is going to be a long project, but basically we should start by saying individual exploration must be safeguarded. It's really important that we have control of our own bodies and our own minds. And of course, if we have this morphological freedom, the right to change ourselves or say no to changes somebody else, like my boss who might want me to not sleep, well, in that case, it seems like we also need to say that preventing cognitive enhancement in society must point to a very clear social harm. So there might be some enhancements that actually are really bad for society, but then we need to demonstrate that. And we need to think about, compare that to existing enhancement like schools, which are fairly unfair, really expensive, and might have side effects we haven't studied. There are costs of restricting enhancement, which can be actually problematic. And I think controlling technology is a little bit like saying we must control art. Art and technology are actually almost the two sides of the same coin. It's human creativity. It's something we do to expand our reach in the world, either in the world of experience or the world of practical stuff. And yeah, there might be some limits to what we should be doing with art, just like there are limits to what we should be doing to technology. But generally saying, oh, we need to have a central committee to decide what it should be done is not a very good one. Overall, I think enhancement cognition can make society more or less equal. But we can also plan ahead a little bit. We actually have a good chance, since it's still very early days, to control this. And I think in the long run, we will be much better off if we choose the better brains. Thank you. questions about the whole thing?
At the back?
One over there, yeah.
One of the things that has really struck me is that so many of the interventions that we're talking about assume that people can choose to pay attention to things. And I found your paper on the anthropic principle really interesting, mostly from the point of view of looking at why people ignore the threats of climate change. And I've realised, you know, that I hope I've got this the right way, that the bigger the threat, the harder it is for us to face it, to get our heads around it. And what I've realised is the people who are paying attention to the threats also get burnt out very quickly or get traumatised and may get disassociated, so that their ability to make sensible decisions is compromised. What interventions do you think there could be, either for these very smart people who are dealing with the big problems, or for society as a whole, in getting everybody up to speed so they can make informed decisions in general?
So I think the best way of burning yourself out is to realize, oh, this is the most important thing I could possibly be doing, and then spend all your time working, because you're the only guy working on it. If you're not doing it, nobody will be working on the super important problem. That's kind of the road to burnout. Yes. I'm kind of insulated because I'm kind of easily distracted. So even though I know, oh, this is the most important thing I could be doing, oh, I've been doing something else all the time. But generally, when I'm looking at smart people working at important world problems that are at risk of burning out, the problem is, of course, they're working alone. If more people could help them and create support infrastructures for it. So generally, I actually have this little slide which I jumped over, but it turns out that in many domains our priorities are really badly set up. The most important thing to do is usually several times, sometimes more than 10 times more important than the second most important thing. So to the left here are the cost effectiveness of different ways of fighting AIDS. And it turns out that the best one is about 2,000 times better than the top one. So the problem is, charities are giving to all of these at about equal levels. If we just put a little bit more in the really effective ones, we would get way more help. And pointing out this problem, this is based on data that has been kind of in the World Health Organization's archives for ages, but most people don't pay attention because it's boring statistics. Getting people's attention about this, kind of shaking them, look at this, this is what we ought to be doing, has an enormous effect. But this goes in a lot of domains, and one thing I noticed when I looked at the literature of metacognition is that actually reorganizing even an imperfect list slightly better has an enormous effect.
So this would be a good cognitive enhancement to have, if it were possible.
Yeah, and this is not obvious that you can get by taking a pill. It's not like there is a pill I take and immediately my priorities straighten out. It would be awesome, but I doubt you can make such a pill.
So maybe in a few months we'll have you back talking about how to figure out which of these risks and issues deserve the highest priority.
Could be. I'm actually working on a paper about this problem, about why our priorities are so bad and how much do we gain from getting slightly better. But I think the solution is not going to be a pill or a brain stimulation. It's probably going to be a bit more institutional awareness of this problem, and then maybe we make software that help us handle priorities better. Sometimes the hybrid solutions are better than the single methods.
We don't have time for too many questions, unfortunately. Let's take a few quick ones.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, Anders. So you had this slide on this report by Future Humanity Institute on the future of jobs, which you skipped unfortunately, which I find very interesting. So this slide then says that, well, lots of low-skilled jobs are at risk of becoming automated. So what do you think about this, that perhaps there won't be many jobs for low-skilled people in the future, and then they will actually need cognitive enhancement because they will become much more unhappy and their life satisfaction will become lower than it is today.
So I think it's not the low-skilled people who need to be worried about jobs, because it might not be any jobs for anybody. So it turns out that this list of jobs, the most automatable job on Carl and Michael's list was telemarketer. which is a fairly low-skilled job.
Yeah.
The second top one was insurance underwriter, which is not a low-skilled job. The reason is that, at least as they marked it up, I have some quibbles about it, is that it's a fairly intellectual routine job, but it requires a bit of brain power, except, of course, that that can be put into a computer. Meanwhile, the registered nurse was the safest job on the list. So, in a sense, there are the routine jobs that are really in trouble here. While the jobs requiring creativity and intelligence, they are actually fairly safe. But I generally agree with you that a lot of the people who are good at the routine jobs, they are the ones that might actually need the enhancement so they can move into the ones requiring creativity, strategic and social intelligence. And of course this goes in a lot of domains too. I think the most scary part is of course that some of the high status routine jobs that you find in middle management and bureaucracy, they've also got a rather powerful political and social voice. So when they get threatened by machines, it's going to be a lot of reaction to it. It's one thing when the dishwashers are in trouble. They don't really write in the Times very much. But when the middle management suddenly find themselves replaced by short pieces of software, oh dear.
If I understand the logic of the argument correctly, we live in a sort of unequal society right now, and if we increase our tech enhancement in digital way, we probably will still remain unequal society in some similarly distributed way, which really means that Gattaca, which I'm sure you know, is an okay society. I mean, if I just follow that logic through, it's how it should end up, following that technological enhancement. And I'm sitting here thinking, why I'm rebelling inside that thought, and I can't explain it. I always thought that was a very good film, science fiction film about some ethical dilemmas, and I don't want to go that direction. But if I follow your logic, it sort of should be all right.
Well, the problem with the Gattaca society seems to be that you actually have limited opportunities if you're not enhanced in that society, and you cannot change the fact that you're not enhanced. So
very similar to what we've got now. Maybe not all.
Yes and no. So the problem, Gattaca is kind of stylized. That's also what probably makes it a pretty good movie. And as a parenthesis, it's kind of interesting to notice that the real Übermensch in the whole movie is, of course, the protagonist who just got this ridiculous level of willpower. The only other person that seemed to be really enhanced is actually this 12-fingered piano player who plays really complex music. None of the genetically enhanced people actually seem to be much good at anything in particular. But the real problem seems to be the social setup. There is only one scale of achievement that matters. And if you're not doing well on it, well, you're low on the totem pole. And actually having a good genome, that's kind of a bad measure of how good you are at anything. After all, the protagonist, he's kind of outperforming the genetically enhanced people because he's using his ridiculous level of motivation instead of genetics in order to achieve the things. So what you should be measuring is, of course, actual ability to do stuff. In that case, he obviously should be in the space program from the start, no matter how bad his genes are, because he's practically good. It's a bit like doing a gene test on people before giving them a job. It's probably smarter to check, have they actually done a good job before? That's good evidence that they can do the job. That they have the right genome doesn't tell you very much. It gives you a bit of statistics, but knowing more about the person actually tells you something.
So Gattaca forms into the pattern of Hollywood, that it tells an interesting, compelling and seemingly plausible story, but when you dig into it more fully, it's actually missing a whole key.
Yeah, but I think it's an interesting thing. I think the creator actually got fairly close. It's just that the society it shows is also obsessed with the wrong thing. It's a bit like a society where you think noble birth is what matters, because you believe nobles are better at everything.
But continuing that argument, in a way, your presentation is an example of a little bit of the same logic. We had a little bit of that discussion. People raised the issue of motivation as being one that maybe we should be looking at much more closely. Instead, people looking at physical enhancement of IQ abilities, which actually getting us much closer to the Gattaca type society than I would want to see.
Well, imagine the motivation of Gattaca society. So there was some training that made you really ambitious. Actually, this is probably a state religion of America, where you have self-esteem and all these self-help books and so on. And imagine that they actually really worked. Just having loads of motivation and no skills and so on would be a rather bad thing too. And in fact, there is a real problem with people having very high self-esteem, but very no reason to have high self-esteem because they need to protect that very inflated self-esteem. You get a lot of bad psychology from that. Ideally, you want the right composition, which is not always easy to do. And this is, of course, the hard part about living a good life. You want to combine the right level of motivation with the right skills and the right life project. If they don't fit together, then you're going to be unhappy. So I'm not saying that, we should all throw everything overboard except intelligence. Intelligence is one thing I happen to know a fair bit about and can say a bit about how to motivate. There is not that much papers yet about motivational enhancement. I think there ought to be. And I'm not saying that it would be a good world if we just enhance intelligence. I also think it's unlikely that we would just enhance intelligence because it's so hard. It might be easier to actually enhance a little bit of intelligence, a little bit of memory, a little bit of motivation, and gradually we're moving in that direction. But my real message is, I think diversity really matters. We need different ways of solving things. And I think in the future we might end up with a world that is much more diverse. So in one sense it's much more unequal than current, because people are very, very different. But I think among many measures they will be better. And the distance among some distances socially might actually become smaller. I don't know whether this part.
So I'm not going to take any more questions, but I'll take some comments, or you can ask a question.
There is going to be a pub afterwards anyway.
This is just an observation that fairness here is extremely connected to a society that is based on a monetary system, and so. Perhaps an idea for futurists to discuss ideas or possibilities for creating a society that is not based on a monetary system.
Well, even if you didn't have money, you would still have potential unfairness. Think about social status, which I think is way worse than money in many ways, because it's a definite zero-sum game. So if people care about where they are ranked socially, there is only a particular ladder you can climb up and down on, and the only way of getting up is somebody else to go down. That's way worse. And a lot of people seem to think social status is really the most awesome thing ever, which I think is very bad. So we need more ladders, and money is one that some people will care deeply about. But I think the real solution is making a system where people have more freedom to choose in what directions they want to go. And of course, if we have a post-scarcity society where you don't need to worry too much about paying the rent, so much better.
We'll talk about that in the pub. Laurie?
I feel like you've just come to the threshold of the question I wanted to ask all the way through, which is, you started out talking about smart drugs that have pros and cons. Then you switched to doing analysis that was based on a uniform concept of enhancement. And all through, you've used the word enhancement, 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 as if there's simply the concept of this change is better. Now, it's modification that has advantages and disadvantages. You finally came around to once mentioning enhancing groups, and then at the very end, started speaking about diversity. And all my notes say, diversity, modification, and why have you said the word enhance? Well, and I'm sorry, change it to just a comment. You've been saying enhancement so many times, and you've only said diversity and enhancing groups through diversity a couple of times. It feels inside out.
Okay.
There's my comment.
Yeah, it's a good point, and the real reason is I should be better at time management, because I have a lot to say about groups and diversity.
The words aren't on the slides. Even the slides, the words.
Oh yes, well actually, this slide I actually have loads of pages of stuff, but not enough time. This is for the pub. But
your enhancement regime isn't yet giving you the time management.
A really good time management course and the intelligence from Limitless, I would choose the time management.
We're almost at the end. That's it?
Yes. My comment is on the slide in which you showed juxtaposed individual and society as in a prisoner's dilemma matrix. Is this really a decision for society to make, because once technological divisions, technological advantages start to happen, I believe it will be the individuals that make those decisions, and if they are curtailed by a legal or regulatory mechanism in one part of the world, they'll simply go somewhere else to seek that enhancement. And to prevent that, you will need a screening mechanism, and that then leads to Ramiz Nam's crux sort of world.
Yeah. So I think the important part here is when you put it like a kind of game theory matrix, it sounds like this is a game played between two players, society and the individual. And that's of course not entirely true, both because there is a lot more individuals and so on. But second, this is a tool for us to think ahead of time. That's mostly why I put it in. Once a technology exists, it's very hard to budge what's happening. It's also very hard to prevent a technology from coming into being. However, we can frame it in different ways in the early days. There's a lot of flexibility when something is still not quite working. Most enhancers are rather crappy today. Most of the outsourced cognition is not good enough. It's getting there. The smart drugs are going to get better, and people are going to use them in different ways. But still, it's very much up in the air, which actually gives us a chance to budge them in different directions. Which is why I think this is useful, because we can actually see which enhancement looks like, this might be ending up in the red quadrant. We might want to see if we can frame it in such a way that we get more of at least the yellow or perhaps even green one. So I'm thinking of this more as a tool for thinking about the technology we are developing right now, the technology we're promoting. Can we promote them so they go in the right direction? Think about email. The spam is inherent in the assumptions in the email protocol. But nobody believed that when they invented it back in the 70s and 80s, because there wasn't enough people on the internet at that time for spam to be a problem. It just emerged once you have enough people. And then it's very hard to change, because now you set up some of the assumption that it shouldn't cost you anything to send a lot of messages. We should be thinking in the same way about our technologies that we're developing and promoting. Could there be some counterpart to spam? Could we end up in the red quadrant or some of the bad social patterns? Could we explain this to people in ways so they invent it in the right way?
So let's think ahead to how spam might manifest itself, not as obviously spam, but something similar to spam. So we're going to continue the discussion in the pub. So everybody who wanted to say more is welcome to join in the pub. I'll come back to Anders in a moment. I do want to make a couple of quick announcements first. So if you're interested in enhancement, and you're more interested in bodily enhancement or health enhancement than brain enhancement, then 2 weeks' time we have Professor Stephen Minger, who is the chief scientist from GE Healthcare and world expert on stem cells. He is going to be talking to us, not in this room, but in another room on this floor. You can see it on the meetup site. He is going to be talking to us about the state-of-the-art in regenerative medicine, stem cell therapy, and also the blue skies scenarios, which he thinks is just around the corner, which will take us even further than the stem cells we're doing already. So that's in 2 weeks' time. In 4 weeks' time, we're going to come back to a question which has been touched on here, which is what are we all going to do if automation puts most of us out of work? Is there a case for what is being called the universal basic income? So that one is not yet on the meetup site. Well, it is actually, if you go there, you'll see it, but it hasn't been announced because you're just fine-tuning some of the announcement text. But in 4 weeks' time, which some of you may realize is Valentine's Day. So we'll do it in the afternoon and leave you to have Valentine's evening. But you can bring your soulmates to the afternoon and get a really good intellectual mood. And that will be the case for basic income, looking at the pros and cons of reorganizing our society. There are a couple of other things that are on this site which haven't been announced yet. There are some other issues that are rising. A lot of this has political implications. And are all politicians thinking hard enough about this? Are our politicians really on top of this? And some of us think that the political discussion that's going on just now is not focused enough on the future. It's focusing on what are we going to do to fix the GDP, what are we going to do to fix the present day problems. Whereas by 5 years' time, things might be quite different. So there is an organisation that's been spun up in the last few weeks, associated with London Futurists. It's a separate thing. It's called the Transhumanist Party. Julian Snape is here in the audience. He is the national communicator for the Transhumanist Party, and he actually has some information with him. If any of you feel that the present day politicians aren't doing a very good job, on this kind of topic. If you feel you would like to be a member of parliament for the Transhumanist Party, if you feel that you've got what it takes to out-argue some of the politicians and you don't mind knocking on doors, then please see Julian, because Julian, amongst others, is looking for a number of candidates to actually become potential prospective MPs for a Transhumanist Party. There is a separate related thing, which I'm more responsible for, a new organisation, a think tank, which we're talking about shortly, which is going to try and feed in ideas about a better set of politics. It's provisionally called Transpolitica, anticipating tomorrow's politics. Just as transhumanism is about anticipating tomorrow's humanity. Anticipating in the sense of thinking ahead about it, seeing what's good about the possibilities and bringing the good things forward, also seeing what's bad in some scenarios and making sure we don't get there. So transhumanism is anticipating tomorrow's humanity and making that positive things happen. Transpolitica is about anticipating the better politics of tomorrow when we take advantage of technology, we take advantage of new kinds of democracy, advantage of new kinds of technology to improve how society as a whole works. And so that organisation will work with multiple political parties. It will work with the Transhumanist Party to ensure that they get the best support possible. But if you, for whatever reason, think you'd rather have your favourite Liberal Democrat or Conservative or Labour or Green politician in power and you want to support them and turn them more in favour of this technology viewpoint, then you can work with this think tank. So there'll be more announcements about that shortly. Having said all that, I do invite all of you who wish to continue this discussion to come with us to the pub, which is just 10 minutes walk away, and the Marlborough Arms, where Anders has kindly volunteered to continue sharing some of the insights of his fascinating research and ideas. And let's give Anders another very warm round of applause.